Part 1, Chapter 1. A Tale to Tell. It is night, and our old house by the river is finally quiet. The baby has stopped its crying and been soothed back to sleep. Only the gentle lapping of the River Thames can be heard outside my window. London is wrapped in a deep sleep, waiting for the watchman to call in the new day. I have lit the first of 7 candles to write my story by. On the table next to me is the silk purse that holds my mother's pearls, and beside it is the ebony box, whose treasures I am only now beginning to understand. Next to that, shining nearly as bright as the moon, stands a pair of silver shoes. I have a great many things to tell, of how I came by the silver shoes and more. And this being my story, and a fairy tale besides, I will start once upon a time. My name is Coriander Chapter. I am the only child of Thomas and Eleanor Chapter, being born in this house in the year of our Lord 1643. It is just a stone's throw from London Bridge, with the river running past the windows at the back. To the front is my mother's once beautiful walled garden that leads through a wooden door out into the bustling, busy street. The garden is all overgrown now. It has been neglected for far too long. Once it was full of flowers and herbs of all description, whose perfume could make even the Thames smell sweet. But now rosemary and nettles, briar roses and brambles have reclaimed it as their own. It was this garden, the like of which no neighbors had ever seen, that first sent tongues wagging. My father planted it for my mother, and built her a very pretty still room that backed onto the wall of the counting house. My mother, in her quiet way, knew more about herbs and their powers than anyone else, and together with her waiting woman, Mary Danes, she would spend hours in the still room, making all sorts of potions that were distilled and stored in tiny bottles. When I was small, I used to hide under my mother's petticoats, and listen to friends and neighbors as they brought their ailments to her like poses of sorrow, to be made better by one of her remedies. Later on, when I was too big to hide, they came to ask her other things, for by this time her reputation as a cunning woman with magical powers had spread as thistledown does, blown on the hot winds of gossip. My first memories were of the garden, and of this my old bedchamber, whose walls my mother painted with fairy places and imaginary beasts. She wrote under each one in her fair script, and for every picture she had a story, as bright and telling as the colors in which they were painted. When I was small, I used to trace the letters with my fingers, to feel how the spidery writing was raised above the wooden paneling, and I would say the names to myself like a magic charm to keep harm at bay. All the pictures, like the garden's blooms, are gone now, washed and scrubbed away. Only the faintest trace of the gold letters remain. They still shine through, like the memories. I used to believe that my mother's life had started with me, and that before I made my entrance into this world, there was nothing. Nothing, that is, until the midsummer's day when my father, Thomas Chapter, first saw my mother standing under an oak tree on a country lane. This is the story he told me, and the story I love the best. When he was a young merchant with a head full of dreams, he put his hard-earned savings together with what little money his father left him into a ship bound for Constantinople, banking on her return with a cargo of silk. Alas, news reached him that she had been lost in a great storm at sea, so now he owned nothing but the clothes on his back. In despair, my father walked out of the city and some 10 miles into the country, on a chance of being able to borrow money from a distant cousin, a Master Stoop. When he arrived, he found that Master Stoop had been given up the never-ending struggle with the living, and had joined the ranks of the dead, leaving a wife and several small Stoops to be looked after. My father had not the heart to ask for anything. Having paid his last respects, he set out mournfully to the road to London, resigned to his fate. It was getting late when he met a strange-looking man with a long beard tied in a knot, holding a lantern as round as the moon. The stranger told him he had been robbed by highwaymen, who had taken all he owned, leaving him just the lantern. My father felt sorry to hear of this misfortune, and offered him the cloak his cloak to keep the chill off. The stranger accepted it with thanks. "Young man, to travel with an open and loving heart is worth more than all the gold coins in a treasure chest," he said. "Tomorrow your kindness will be rewarded." My father wished the fellow well, and hoped that nothing more would befall him. Then he set off again, with only the light of the moon to show him the way. As he walked, a wave of tiredness came over him, and he lay down to sleep. The next morning he had not gone far when he thought he might be lost, for in the dawn light everything looked different. At this point, I, having heard the story so many times that I could repeat it word for word, would interrupt and say, "But you were on the right road." He would laugh and reply, "It was a road that would lead me to your mother, so how could it be wrong?" To my childish way of thinking, it seemed that he met and married my mother in the space of one day. They arrived back in the city after the wedding to be greeted with astonishing news that his ship had returned safe and sound with a cargo of fine silk. From that day forward my father's life had been charmed with love and good fortune. No other merchant ships fared as well. Untouched by pirates, wars, or tempests, his ship sailed unmolested in calm seas, bringing back bounty fit for kings. Before long my father was wealthy enough to be able to build this house for us by the river, where we lived in great luxury, having a cook and servants to look after us, as well as Sam, my father's faithful apprentice. It was no surprise to me that all this should happen so fast. It never entered my head to ask what my mother's family thought of her daughter marrying a young man who was penniless, or even if she had any family to mind. All these questions, and many more besides, only occurred to me much, much later, when there was no one left to ask. My father had 2 miniature paintings done of them both, shortly after their wedding. My mother's portrait showed her wearing a cream gown, beautifully embroidered and oversewn with tiny glimmering pearls. I imagine this is how she looked when my father first saw her that midsummer's day under the oak tree. Wildflowers are woven into her hair, and in her hand she holds an oak leaf. In the background of this tiny painting, oh, it always fascinated me. It is as if you are a bird looking down from a great height, seeing the land mapped out below. There, in the forest of oak trees, is a clearing in which there is a grand house with formal gardens. In the distance, a tower stands tall over the trees, and I could just make out a figure at the top of the tower watching over the landscape, searching for something or someone. On the edge of the forest is a hunting party with dogs. Compared to the house and the towers, they look oddly large. A hawk sits on the outstretched arm of one of the riders. Another rider is standing up in his saddle, blowing a horn. I looked at this painting many times before I spotted the white horse and the fox hidden in the thicket. For some reason that I cannot explain, their discovery worried me greatly. It gave me an uneasy feeling, as though nothing was safe. My father's portrait shows him looking young and handsome. He is clean-shaven, wearing breeches and a linen shirt embroidered in the same pattern as my mother's dress. The scene behind him could not be more different. It is a view of a city with a river running through it like an opal-green ribbon. You could be forgiven for thinking it a picture of London, except the houses are brightly painted, and mermaids and sea monsters can be seen in the water amongst a fleet of tall ships with full-blown sails. Even then, these 2 miniatures looked to me strangely out of time, as if they had been painted long, long ago, in another world entirely. I know now what they mean. I know why my mother kept silent, and why at my darkest moment her past claimed me, leading me back to something that could no longer be denied.